This happened back in the 1990s in a fading, gloomy industrial town in Maine. My parents had gone to work far away in Alaska to make a living, leaving me under the strict care of my grandmother in the cramped, gray apartment building on the bleak outskirts of the city. I had just transitioned into the second grade, making me around 7 years old, while the entire neighborhood crew of kids was at least 5 or 6 years older than me. Because of this massive age gap, and despite my grandmother's fierce prohibitions, I frequently sneaked away to play on the adjacent streets just to escape the loneliness. Pretty soon, I fell in with a rough crowd of older boys. I cannot say we were actual friends. I simply had no other choice, and I lacked the brains at that age to realize that they were merely using me for their own amusement. Their manipulation scheme was incredibly simple. They would constantly take me on a dare, proposing various bets and games that it was physically impossible for the 7-year-old to win. Afterwards, they would aggressively remind me that for a real man, a bet is a matter of absolute honor. I had to pay off these manufactured debts with my lunch money, candy, or rare comic books. They played their roles perfectly, keeping me in a perpetual state of artificial debt. I don't quite remember the exact day they lured me to the ruins of an old colonial stone mansion deep in the dense woods. We spent an hour exploring the crumbling, moss-covered brick walls and climbing through shattered foundations. The atmosphere among the dark trees was heavy, and the ruined structure looked like a decaying jaw rising from the earth. The ultimate test to clear my entire debt was laid out before me. I had to descend a narrow, crumbling flight of stone stairs leading down into the earth, open a heavy, rotten wooden door, and step into the absolute darkness of the subterranean cellar, pulling the door shut behind me. That was it. If I succeeded, my dad would be entirely forgiven, and no one would ever question my bravery again. But if I failed, my dad would instantly double. A couple of the older boys began to nudge me, whispering that it was a total piece of cake. I vividly remember catching a predatory, hungry look in their eyes at that moment. They knew exactly how much I was terrified of the dark, and they were savoring my fear. I slowly walked down the damp stone steps, my boots crunching on loose gravel. Inside my chest, a desperate hope lingered that the ancient door would be rusted shut, ending the nightmare right there. But as I reached out, the heavy iron bolt slid back with an effortless, oily click. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently to the void beyond. From the pitch-black space behind the wood, someone or something let out a soft, long sigh of pure anticipation. It was the kind of deep breath a person takes in the morning when they are looking forward to something wonderful from the brand new day. I spun around in panic. My so-called companions were standing at the top of the stairs, their faces twisted into ugly, mocking grins. A sudden burning urge flamed up inside me to smash those smirks off their faces. I turned back, pulled the iron handle, and threw the heavy door wide open. The floor past the threshold was entirely covered in a thick layer of fine white sand, which looked deeply unnatural for an underground cellar. Stepping over the threshold, I pulled the rotten door closed. The moment it touched the frame, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the heavy bolt slid into place from the outside. Instantly, a loud, mocking explosion of laughter erupted from the other side of the wood. I panicked, throwing my weight against the door, pounding my fist against the thick planks, weeping and begging them to let me out. From the outside, they just kept laughing, shouting through the cracks that I had to pay a massive monthly tribute in candy and give them half of my prized toy collection if I ever wanted to see the sun again. I was terrified enough to agree to all of their cruel demands, but before I could scream a response, a sudden wave of freezing, icy breath blasted against my bare neck from the depth of the cellar. A violent, uncontrollable shudder ranged my entire body. As my eyes frantically adjusted to the absolute pitch-black darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. Deep in the shadows, on the white sand, a tall, monstrous silhouette began to manifest. It was an impossible creature, grotesquely elongated, with thin, multi-jointed limbs and two large, milky white, hollow eyes that shifted rhythmically in the dark, staring directly into my soul. Pure, suffocating horror paralyzed me. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto my knees, burying my face against the rough wood of the door. The dark cellar felt like a trap closing in, and I felt as though the door was made of the cardboard, wishing I could just smash my head right through it to escape, but I had absolutely no physical strength left to stand up. I just sat there in the white sand, feebly thumping my skull against the boards. Suddenly, something incredibly sharp and cold dragged slowly down my spine. The sound of my heavy jacket fabric ripping apart echoed like a thunderclap in the confined space, leaving a freezing, slimy trail against my skin. A set of rough, leathery fingers crept up toward my throat. They wrapped around my neck, squeezing with agonizing force. From the outside, one of the boys shouted a question, asking what I was doing. I desperately tried to scream that I would give them everything I owned, but the entity's grip was so tight that only a pathetic, choked whimper escaped my lips. And just as the darkness was about to completely swallow my consciousness, the outside lock suddenly clicked. The door flew open and I tumbled backward out onto the stone steps, sobbing hysterically. My older boys stood over me, pointing and roaring with laughter at my tears. I don't remember exactly what cruel words they hurled at me, but that was the exact moment I experienced a blinding, consuming hatred for the first time in my life. I wanted those three bullies to burn alive. I wiped the tears from my eyes, stood up, and looked them dead in the face. I told them that I would give them all my comic books, my entire toy collection, and my grandfather's prized vintage military binoculars if they had the guts to step into the cellar themselves and prove it was empty. Their arrogant expressions shifted into greedy smirks. One of them spat on the ground and said, "Watch this, you little punk. We'll show you there is nothing to be scared of." The three of them stepped over the threshold onto the white sand. The heavy wooden door creaked on its rusty hinges and slowly swung shut behind them with a soft click. I stood on the stone steps, my heart racing, waiting for them to start pounding on the wood or laughing. But what followed was an immediate muffled shriek of absolute blood-curdling regret from inside the cellar. It was cut off instantly, followed by a wet, heavy thud. Then, a dead, eternal silence enveloped the ruins. I stood there for a long time as the sun went down, but not a single sound ever came from behind the door again. When darkness completely covered the woods, I calmly turned around and walked home. One day, after a long day of wandering through the dense forest, a hunter was caught in the middle of the thicket by a stormy night. It had already gotten dark, freezing rain began to fall, and having no idea of his location, he decided to keep walking in one direction until he made it out of the woods. After several grueling hours of walking, he stumbled into a small clearing, in the middle of which stood a wooden cabin. Realizing he had no chance and could freeze to death, he decided to stay in the cabin for the night. The door was unlocked, and no one was inside. The hunter, exhausted to the bone, lay down on the single creaky bed. Looking around the dark cabin, the hunter was surprised to find that all the walls were decorated with several portraits painted in great, intricate detail. Without exception, all the pale faces in the portraits stared at him maliciously and with clear threat. The hunter felt extremely uncomfortable under their piercing gazes. Ignoring the faces in the paintings that glared at him with hatred, he turned to face the wooden wall, covered himself with his jacket, and quickly fell asleep. The next morning, he woke up to bright sunlight hitting his face. Looking around the bright room, he froze. He saw that there were absolutely no portraits on the walls in the cabin. There were only windows. A few years ago, my older brother passed away. Shortly before his sudden death, he had moved into an off-the-grid cabin in a semi-abandoned logging village deep in the Maine woods. He bought the property from the previous owners for dirt cheap. His death was completely unexpected. He wasn't sick and never complained about his health. He was a cheerful guy who just wanted to live away from civilization. But the circumstances of his death were deeply disturbing. His body was found on a dirt road leading to the village. He was missing his left leg, and his face was frozen in a grotesque grimace of pure terror. The local authorities concluded he was the victim of a brutal bear attack. Even then, a worm of doubt crept into my soul. My brother never stepped foot in those woods without his hunting rifle. Yet no rifle was found near his body. I couldn't logically explain his bizarre death any other way. I buried my brother. As his only remaining relative, I inherited that cheap cabin. On one sunny Sunday, I decided to drive up to the village. The town had no name. It was officially listed in country records as condemned. There were no road signs, so I navigated using coordinates. I arrived around noon. It consisted of crumbling, rotten houses, pathways overgrown with weeds, dead gardens, and leaning fences. But the most overwhelming impression was the absolute crushing silence. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves. The village consisted of 2 small blocks. The perimeter was enclosed by a massive wooden fence with only one entrance. The block where my brother's house stood was to the left of the gate. I decided to walk around the entire block first, inspecting this strange and gloomy area. Suddenly, I heard a sharp squeak. It sounded exactly like a metal saw scraping against a rusty pipe. The source was an open window in one of the neighboring houses. I saw a freight curtain swaying slightly and realized why the sound was so unnerving. Besides my own footsteps and the rustling dry grass, it was the only sound in this entire place. I got this heavy sensation that someone was watching me from the shadows. After a short walk, I finally gathered the courage to inspect my brother's house. It was a 2-story cabin. On the first floor, right past the entryway, was the kitchen. On the dining table sat a plate of half-eaten roasted potatoes, giving off a savory aroma. I cautiously took a fork and took a small bite. The potatoes were piping hot. The very second I put the fork back down, a sound echoed from the hallway. A small metal ball, about an inch in diameter, bouncing down the wooden stairs from the second floor. It hit every single step before rolling across the floorboards and coming to a stop right under the chair. I pulled the chair back to pick it up, but I didn't find the ball. I inspected the bottom of the chair, but I didn't see the ball this time either. It had completely vanished. I started feeling deeply uneasy. I had absolutely zero desire to go up to the second floor to investigate. I decided that 15 minutes in this village was more than enough for me. I glanced down at my watch to check the time. It was already 1:30. It was impossible that I had been there for an hour and a half, but the hands on the clock showed exactly that time. Suddenly, a deafening stomping and crashing erupted from right above my head. It sounded as if 10 heavy men had simultaneously jumped out of their beds on the second floor. Pure blinding panic seized me. I sprinted out of the house. I threw a quick glance at the spot where I had parked my car. To my absolute horror, it had been moved. It was now parked completely outside the block, in the different part of the village. I was running away from that damn house, but something was already coming down the stairs to greet me, probably exactly the way it had greeted my brother. As I ran past the front of the house, I glanced back at the window and saw it. It had an unnaturally square face. Right in the middle was a tiny nose, and below it a gaping maw. There were no eyes on its head at all. I bolted toward the car like a bullet. As I jumped into the driver's seat, the creature stepped out of the front door. It looked like a deformed humanoid, missing its left arm, but with a grotesquely muscular right arm. This massive arm wasn't growing from the shoulder, but protruding horribly from its shoulder blade. I slammed on a gas pedal and sped past it. I was driving away in a state of absolute shock. After putting some distance between myself and the village, I checked my watch. It was 10 minutes to 4. Time was completely broken. At exact 4 o'clock, I pulled off the dirt road onto the main highway. I pulled over to the shoulder, opened the door, and fell to my knees in the grass, violently sick. I stared back in terror toward the turnoff leading to the village. Ever since that day, I only sleep with the lights on. I put the house up for sale the exact same day, asking for half the price my brother paid. I explicitly wrote that it required major renovations. A buyer appeared, a young pair of newlyweds wanting a secluded honeymoon. The price was so attractive that they gladly agreed. A month after the sale, I received tragic news. The young bride was brutally murdered out there. Her eyes had been completely scratched out, and her husband had lost his mind. The property was immediately seized by the state. Investigators came to my house, but I lied. I answered that I had only been there for a few minutes and knew nothing. Today, that entire area is some kind of restricted military or government facility, completely surrounded by barbed wire fences. People on the internet write that there is a massive magnetic anomaly zone there. On Google Earth satellite maps, that specific spot just shows an endless, dense forest. What is actually going on out there right now, I don't know, and I never want to know. This story didn't happen to me, but when it was told to me, I didn't doubt its truth for a second. In the summer of 2009, I went to visit my grandmother in the remote mountain town in Appalachia, West Virginia. The kind of place where cell service dies and everyone knows everyone's business. There, through a lucky coincidence, I met a great local girl named Chloe. Chloe had an older brother named Luke. He was built like a brick outhouse, a real mountain man. At first, he glared at me like a wolf, and there were even a few threats, but eventually we found common ground. Luke turned out to be a normal guy, and one fine day, we agreed to go fishing together at the local lake. The sun was beating down relentlessly. The fish were biting reluctantly, and the mosquitoes were eating us alive. Thank God Luke brought along a cure for the sweltering boredom. A large mason jar of strong homemade local moonshine. We quickly finished it off, the liquid burning our throats. After that, we kind of stopped caring about the fish, and we started chatting about everything. Suddenly, Luke became very serious. His gaze darkened, and he told me a story that happened to him before he ever met me. Luke had a childhood friend named Tommy. The two of them were inseparable back in the day. They often visited abandoned forest cabins miles off the main road, looking for old coins, antique bottles, or copper wire to scrap for cash. One dead of night, fueled by boredom and cheap beer, they decided to explore an old, rotting, uninhabited house that was located deep in the woods. They approached the house and pulled the front door. It was locked. They walked around the house and saw a window that had been ripped out along with its frame. The guys climbed inside through it. Inside the house, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. Everything was turned upside down. Dirty, mildewed sheets were scattered across the floor. A rusted iron bed was flipped over, and the heavy wooden table was broken in half. While they were sifting through the trash in the pale beams of their flashlights, they suddenly started hearing some noise from outside. At first, they thought it was a wild dog or a coyote, but they still decided to lay low and turn off the lights. Luke told me that for some reason, at that exact moment, a chilling fear pierced his soul. The noise outside wouldn't stop. In the absolute suffocating silence of the Appalachian night, you could clearly hear thick, dry branches snapping loudly under someone's feet. And suddenly, it dawned on Luke. A dog or a coyote cannot be that heavy. Whatever was walking outside was massive, and it was walking on two legs. The footsteps were slow, heavy, and deliberate, pacing back and forth in front of the porch. At that very moment, Luke became truly terrified. His mouth went completely dry, and his heart started hammering against his ribs. Then Luke noticed his friend. Tommy was standing motionless, staring at a single spot, and his face was completely contorted with unspeakable terror. Luke slowly turned his head at the exact same spot. He froze, staring right at them through the empty, shattered window with the massive god's face. It wasn't just an animal. It was too high off the ground, hunched over broad humanoid shoulders. Its face was pale, covered in filthy, matted fur that reeked of copper and wet earth. But the worst part was the eyes. Human eyes, but with horizontal pupils gleaming with a sickly, intelligent malice. Running out of the house was terrifying because that thing was standing right outside the only exit. They just stood frozen in the dark, trapped, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the god's face slowly lowered down and disappeared into the shadows. Dead silence fell over the woods. Tommy and Luke continued to stand like statues, afraid to even breathe. About 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. They nervously started to think that everything was fine and the creature had left. But suddenly, from outside, right next to the closed front door, someone yelled. It was a macabre, distorted voice. It sounded like a vocal cord trying to mimic a human, but it was pitched wrong, vibrating in a demonic register.
Open the door, or it's going to be worse.
Right after those words, something started slamming into the old wooden door. The blows were of such inhuman, explosive strength that the entire cabin shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Tommy went into full hysterics. He dropped his flashlight and started sobbing uncontrollably, covering his ears. After about the third massive blow, the rusted lock gave out. The door violently smashed wide open. Luke didn't wait for that thing to step into the room. Beside himself with primal fear, he sprinted toward the broken window. He vaulted through the splintered frame and landed hard on the muddy ground outside. And in that exact second, he heard a heart-rending, agonizing scream from Tommy echoing out of the pitch-black cabin. A wet, tearing sound followed. At this point of the story, Luke's voice cracked and his hands were shaking so badly he had to put his drink down. I swear tears welled up in his eyes. Luke ran. How he made it home through the dense pitch-black woods, he couldn't remember himself. Branches whipped his face, tearing his skin, but he didn't stop once. He lay in his bed the entire night, paralyzed, without closing his eyes. Morning finally came. Someone knocked aggressively on Luke's door. It was Tommy's mother. She was in panic. She said that her son came home near dawn, barely alive. His hair, which had been dark brown the day before, had turned completely stark white. When asked what happened, he just mumbled incoherently, stared at his hands, and shook violently. She looked Luke dead in the eyes and asked the question, "Do you know what happened to him out there?" And Luke lied. He swallowed his guilt, said he had no idea, and claimed he had basically sat at home alone all night. From that very day, Tommy completely withdrew into his own mind. He stopped talking, stopped eating, and stopped communicating with anyone, including his own mother. He just stared blankly at the wall, rocking back and forth. A week later, he was taken to the psychiatric asylum, and they keep him there to this day, heavily medicated in the locked ward. The only person in the world besides me that Luke ever dared to tell this story to was his sister Chloe. And thank God she was one of those rare girls who knows how to keep a dark secret. I was the second, and most likely the absolute last person Luke told this horrific truth to, because exactly 2 weeks after our conversation on that lake, Luke died in a horrific fatal motorcycle crash on an empty night highway. They say he swerved off the cliff like he was trying to avoid something standing in the middle of the road. Why he told this story specifically to me, a city guy he had only known for a couple of weeks, I don't know. Probably it was just eating away at his soul. The guilt was gnawing him alive from the inside. He needed to confess it to someone, because if he told his local friends, they would have killed him for abandoning Tommy in that cabin, and the whole town would panic knowing what roams in their woods. Luke knew I was leaving soon and wouldn't tell anyone. To believe in the God-man or not to believe, that is a personal choice for everyone. But looking into Luke's haunted eyes that day, I believed it all. I was born in 1980 and grew up in a small, dying steel town in Ohio, right in the heart of the Rust Belt. It was a very special, unique time. Everything felt somehow easy and uncomplicated. Everyone knew each other, and the exact same families lived in the exact same houses for decades. I still visit my hometown once a year, and it feels like absolutely nothing has changed there. The same old neighbors, the same cashiers in the local stores that survived. But what I remember most from my childhood is my middle school years. Life in the early 90s was completely different. We didn't have smartphones, social media, or modern consoles. We spent our days outside, riding our bikes until the streetlights came on. It was a glorious, carefree time. but it was also when I had the most terrifying experience of my entire life. It was the first and hopefully the absolute last time I ever encountered the supernatural, and I still cannot forget it, even after all these years. I was in the 7th grade, making me about 12 years old. As always, my group of friends and I were hanging out late. It was around 10:30 at night. We were sitting in the dark alleyway, swapping urban legends and ghost stories. Teenage arrogance was in full swing, and my youthful maximalism made me want to prove that I wasn't afraid of anything. Not far from our neighborhood stood an old, partially condemned school building. It looked incredibly menacing in the dark. The dare was simple but terrifying. Break in through the front entrance, sneak past the night watchman, run up to the 3rd floor, open a specific window, and look out at the courtyard. It had to be done in pitch-black darkness, because I absolutely hated feeling weak or giving the other guys a reason to doubt my courage. I foolishly volunteered to do it. As soon as I agreed to the dare, I instantly felt my status rise among the guys. We had 7 people in our group. Riding that massive wave of adrenaline and superiority, I walked to the old school. Standing on the crumbling concrete porch, I peeked through the dirty glass. The night watchman was fall asleep at his desk, his heavy breathing audible even through the thick door. I carefully pulled the door open and slipped into the dusty lobby. I crawled on my stomach right past the guard, slipped behind the concrete pillar, and got to my feet. My friends were supposed to wait outside in the courtyard by the window. I was now on the 1st floor, in total, suffocating darkness without a flashlight. I blindly felt my way along the cold metal lockers to the stairwell. I moved agonizingly slowly. One wrong step and I could fall because it was so dark you couldn't see your own hand. It took me 10 minutes to creep up to the 2nd floor and another 10 to reach the 3rd. As soon as my foot hit the landing of the 3rd floor, my heart stopped. I heard a voice echoing loudly from the very bottom of the stairwell. It was one of my best friends yelling frantically, "Run away, quick! Run back down!" Deep anxiety hit my chest, but just as I turned around to head back down, I heard another shout coming from the courtyard, right outside the open window. It was the exact same friend who had just called me from the stairs. He screamed, "Don't go anywhere! Stand perfectly still and don't move!" I wasn't just scared anymore. I was absolutely paralyzed with a visceral dread. Then, from the dark stairwell below me, the first voice yelled again, "Hurry up and run down! I'm right here! Don't listen to anyone!" I froze, completely immobilized, hot tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to do, who to believe, or where to run. The voice from the stairwell screamed again, but now it sounded like a bizarre chorus of several guys from my group speaking at once. "There is nobody in the courtyard. We're all standing down here. Do not go to the window. We're coming up." Suddenly, an unnatural, guttural roar echoed through the entire building, and the voices from the stairs shouted in perfect unison, "Run!" I screamed hysterically and blindly sprinted down the dark hallway, completely ignoring the window. Heavy thudding inhuman footsteps were rushing up the stairs right behind me. "Don't go to the window! Don't go forward!" The mimicking voices from the stairs shrieked. At the exact same time, a voice from the open window roared, "Jump!" I hit a dead end in the hallway. The things from the downstairs were rushing up, and I was crying and screaming, trapped in the nightmare. Suddenly, my frantically searching hand brushed against a cold metal doorknob at the very end of the corridor. I yanked the heavy door open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I found myself in a cramped utility closet. There was a metal ladder attached to the wall leading up to the roof hatch. Without a single second of hesitation, I scrambled up the rungs, pushed the heavy iron hatch open, and crawled out onto the flat, gravel-covered roof. My heart almost stopped beating entirely. Sitting right there on the roof, huddled together, was my entire group of friends. I screamed in terror, "Don't come near me!" One of my friends rushed over, pushed me hard in the shoulder and hissed, "Are you a complete idiot? We climbed up here using the rusted fire escape. The very second we heard someone calling your name inside the school." I stared at him in absolute shock, my mind completely breaking down. "Wait," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Then who was standing by the window down there?" "We didn't even make it to the window," he replied, shaking like a leaf. "We were walking behind the school, and then we heard our own voices coming from the dark courtyard, and we got terrified." The voices inside the school had gone completely silent, but we were way too terrified to even peek over the edge of the roof. We sat up there shivering until 7 in the morning, until the bright sun came up and the normal people started walking on the streets below. We climbed down the fire escape and never spoke of that horrific story out loud again. But I will remember that terrifying night for the rest of my life.